She came to him with an ultrasound photo and a heart full of hope. He tore it in half without blinking. One photograph, one unborn child, one man who chose his own fear over the truth standing right in front of him, and one woman who had to rebuild her entire life from the wreckage of loving him. This is the story of Emily Brooks and Damien Moretti. A love that started in an elevator and ended in an office with torn paper on a desk. A betrayal that stripped everything down to bone. And a daughter born into the middle of it all. The only innocent party in a mess that two adults made together. Nobody walks away clean from this one. Hit like, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and follow along so you don't miss a single part. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, and Emily Brooks stepped out carrying a manila envelope she'd folded and unfolded so many times the crease had gone soft. The lobby of Moretti Tower's executive level smelled like leather and cold air, and the kind of money that didn't need to announce itself. A single receptionist sat behind a curved white desk, her expression the practiced blankness of someone paid to reveal nothing. "I need to see Mr. Moretti," Emily said. The receptionist didn't look up immediately. She finished whatever she was typing, then lifted her eyes with the particular politeness that was really a form of dismissal. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." "Mr. Moretti doesn't take unscheduled. Tell him it's Emily Brooks, from the Hargrove Analytics Division." She paused. "He'll know the name." Something shifted in the receptionist's face, some micro-expression too fast to read. She picked up the phone, turned slightly away, spoke low. Emily stood with the envelope in both hands and watched the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind the desk. 42 floors down, Chicago moved the way it always moved, fast, indifferent, full of noise that never reached this high. The receptionist set down the phone. "He'll see you. End of the hall, last door on the left." Emily walked the corridor alone. Her heels were quiet on the marble. The hallway was lined with framed photographs. Damien at charity galas, Damien at ribbon cuttings, Damien shaking hands with senators and mayors and men whose names appeared on the sides of hospitals. In every photograph he looked the same. Controlled. Distant. A face that had learned to give nothing away. She'd seen him look different once. More than once. She'd seen him with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, sitting on the edge of a hotel bed at 2 a.m. with a glass of bourbon. He wasn't drinking, staring at the floor. She'd seen him laugh, a real laugh, short and surprised like he'd forgotten he was capable of it. She'd seen him sleep. She stopped in front of the last door and knocked twice. "Come in." Damien Moretti was standing at the window when she entered. He didn't turn immediately. His office was large and spare. A desk that cost more than her car, 2 chairs, a bar cart with bottles arranged by height. No personal photographs. No warmth of any kind. The room felt like a statement. Nothing here is soft. Nothing here is vulnerable. Nothing here is yours. He turned when she was halfway to his desk. He was 41 years old and looked it in the particular way that expensive grooming couldn't entirely conceal. Lines at the corners of his eyes. A jaw that had been clenched too long for too many years. Dark hair gone silver at the temples. He wore a charcoal suit and no tie. His expression when he saw her was unreadable for exactly 2 seconds before something moved through it and locked back down. "Emily." His voice was flat. Not cold exactly, but careful. The voice of a man who had trained himself to neutralize things before they became problems. "I need to talk to you," she said. "You could have called." "I didn't want to do this on the phone." He studied her for a moment. Then he moved to his desk, not sitting, just putting the wood between them, his hands resting on the surface. "All right." She had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it in the bathroom mirror for 3 days, rehearsed it in the car on the drive here, rehearsed it in the elevator, and now every version of it emptied out of her head, and she stood there with the envelope in her hands and said the only words that were left. "I'm pregnant." The room went very quiet. Damien didn't move. His hand stayed flat on the desk. His expression didn't change, and that was the thing that should have warned her. Not anger, not surprise, not the complicated joy she'd allowed herself to imagine in the weaker moments of the past 2 weeks. Nothing. Just a face becoming more still, the way a lake goes still before a storm gets into it. "How far along?" he said. 9 weeks. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "That's not possible." Emily opened the envelope. She crossed to the desk and set the ultrasound photograph in front of him. The grainy black and white image she'd stared at in the doctor's office until her eyes burned. The small, comma-shaped proof of the thing growing inside her, fragile and certain and real. The doctor confirmed it last Tuesday, she said. I have the paperwork. I wanted you to see. Damien picked up the photograph. He looked at it for maybe 4 seconds. Then he tore it in half. Emily stopped breathing. He set the 2 pieces down on the desk with the careful precision of a man who was managing himself very deliberately and said, I had cancer when I was 28, testicular. The treatment left me infertile. I've had it confirmed twice since then by 2 different specialists. His voice was absolutely level. This child is not mine. The torn halves of the ultrasound lay on the desk between them. Emily found her voice somewhere below her sternum. Damien, I want to know whose it is. It's yours. I have never... Don't! The word came out soft, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted it. Don't stand in my office and lie to me. I have been lied to by people much better at it than you. Emily felt heat climb her throat. Her hands were shaking and she pressed them flat against her side so he wouldn't see. I am not lying to you. There is no one else. There has never been anyone else since the night we... Stop. Since the night we started this. Whatever this was. I know what we were to each other. You were a woman I spent time with. His eyes were dark and absolutely flat now, all the warmth she'd ever seen in them erased as completely as if she'd imagined it. That's all it was. It hit her like something physical. She stood still and let it hit her and didn't cry, because she had learned a long time ago that crying in front of men who wanted to see it was the fastest way to lose. I'm telling you the truth, she said quietly. The baby is yours. Then get a paternity test. I plan to, when she's born. But that's 7 months from now, and I thought you deserved to know. Something crossed his face at the word she. Something she couldn't name. I want you to leave, he said. Damien, I want you to leave this office. I want you to think very carefully about whatever game you're playing here, and I want you to understand that I have lawyers who are very good at this particular kind of problem. He straightened up from the desk. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe it was just that the room had gotten smaller. You've worked here 3 years. I'll make sure you're given a severance package that's generous. But your employment at Moretti Corporation is finished. Emily stared at him. You're firing me, she said. I'm offering you a graceful exit. She picked up the 2 halves of the ultrasound photo from the desk. She held them together in her hands, the torn edge running through the middle of the image, through the small shape of the thing that was half her and half him, whether he believed it or not. She looked at it for a moment, then she folded the pieces carefully into the envelope. When she looked back up at him, her voice was very steady. I don't want your money, she said. I don't want your lawyers. I don't want anything from you. That would be a first. The bitterness in it was so sudden and so clean it took her breath away. I loved you, she said. It came out quiet. Not an accusation, not a plea. Just a fact she needed to say out loud, so it existed somewhere outside of her own chest. I want you to know that. Whatever you think of me, whatever you've decided I am, I loved you. Damien said nothing. Emily walked out. She kept her spine straight and her pace even all the way down the corridor, past the photographs of the man she had apparently never known as well as she thought, into the elevator and down 42 floors to the lobby. She pushed through the glass doors and out into the November air and stood on the sidewalk while the city moved around her. Then she let herself shake. 3 months earlier, the story had been entirely different. Emily Brooks had graduated from Northwestern at 26 with a degree in data analytics and a practical-minded determination to build something real. She was not the kind of woman who made romantic choices impulsively. She was careful, deliberate, the type who made spreadsheets when she was anxious and kept her feelings close to the chest. She had grown up watching her mother make bad choices about men and had absorbed the lesson young. Love was something you chose with your head as much as your heart, and anyone who told you different was trying to sell you something. She had taken the position at Moretti Corporation's Hargrove Analytics division because the salary was competitive and the work was interesting. She had known, in the abstract way everyone in Chicago knew, that Damien Moretti was the man whose name was on the building. She had not expected to meet him. The first time was in the elevator. It was a Thursday evening in August, 7:45, and the building was mostly empty. She'd stayed late finishing a risk assessment report that her direct supervisor needed by morning, and when the elevator doors opened on the lobby level, she stepped in, still looking at her phone, and nearly walked into the broadest chest she'd encountered since college. "Sorry," she said, stepping back. "No." His voice was low. "My fault." She looked up. She recognized him immediately. The face from the photographs in the lobby, colder in person and more tired, a man carrying something heavy behind the eyes. He was in his shirt sleeves, jacket folded over one arm, and he looked like a person who had been sitting too long in a room with bad news. "Mr. Moretti," she said, "you work here?" "Hargrove Analytics. Emily Brooks." She hesitated, then added, because she was nervous and sometimes said too much when nervous, "I've been here 3 years and this is the first time I've seen you in the elevator." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I usually take the executive elevator." "Why didn't you tonight?" He looked at her like the question surprised him. "It was occupied." They rode down to this parking garage in silence. When the doors opened, he stepped out first, then turned back. "Hargrove Analytics," he said. "What are you working on?" "Right now, third quarter risk assessment for the Lakeview development." "How does it look?" She considered lying, giving him the optimistic version that her supervisor preferred. Instead, she said, "Honestly, there are 3 variables that your acquisitions team hasn't modeled properly. The projected ROI is about 12% higher than I think it's going to be." He studied her for a moment. "Send me the report." "My supervisor reviews all external communications. Send it to my email directly." He pulled a card from his jacket pocket, his personal card, not the corporate one. "Emily Brooks, Hargrove Analytics." "That's me." "I'll remember it." He walked away into the garage. Emily stood in the elevator with his card in her hand and told herself it was a professional interaction and nothing more. She sent the report. He responded within 20 minutes with 2 questions that proved he'd actually read it. She answered both. He wrote back, and that was how it started. In the margins of business hours, through emails that started professionally and gradually became something else, through one lunch that turned into 3 hours and left her walking back to the office, slightly unsteady, not from anything she'd drunk, but from the particular disorientation of realizing someone you'd expected to be one thing was entirely another. Damien Moretti, the public figure, was armored and remote. Damien Moretti in a booth at the back of a restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon with his phone turned face down and his jacket on the seat beside him was different. He listened in a way that most people didn't. Not waiting for his turn, actually listening, watching her face while she spoke like what she was saying mattered. He was blunt in a way she found refreshing rather than unkind, and occasionally funny in a way that seemed to catch him off guard, like humor was something he'd lost access to and kept finding unexpectedly. But was also guarded in ways she respected because she recognized them. There were doors he didn't open, questions he deflected without deflecting them, whole rooms of himself he kept locked, and she didn't push because she understood the instinct from the inside. She fell in love with him the way she did most things, carefully, against her better judgment, too far gone before she realized it was happening. He'd never told her about the cancer. Not directly. She'd found the scar one night in October, 2 months after the elevator, when they were in a hotel room upstate and the light was low and she'd run her hand along the inside of his thigh and felt the thin line of raised skin and asked without thinking what it was from. He'd been very still for a moment. "Surgery," he said, "a long time ago." "What kind?" He'd looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at her. The kind that changes things. She hadn't pushed. She'd understood it was something that cost him to even say that much, and she'd let it go, filed it in the back of her mind, told herself it didn't matter. Whatever it was in the past. She'd understood later, after everything, that the scar was where the story actually lived. That the locked door she'd decided not to push on was the one behind which all of it was waiting. By November, when she took the pregnancy test at 5:30 in the morning in her apartment bathroom, hands steady because she was the kind of person who stayed steady when she couldn't afford not to, they had been seeing each other for almost 4 months. It was not a formal relationship. There had been no explicit conversation about exclusivity or futures, no meeting of friends or family. But it had been exclusive, on her end, without question. And it had been real. She was certain of that in the way she was certain of very few things. She sat on the cold tile floor with the test in her hand and looked at the 2 lines and thought, this is going to change everything. She was right. She just had no idea how. Now she stood on a Chicago sidewalk in November with a torn ultrasound in a manila envelope and a body that was 9 weeks into the business of making a person, and she allowed herself approximately 4 minutes of shaking before she straightened her spine and took stock. She was 29 years old. She was employed, for now, though apparently not for long. She had $6,000 in savings, a lease that ran through April, a mother in Rockford who would panic, and a best friend named Cassie who would not. She was healthy. The baby was healthy. She had a doctor and an appointment next week, and a body that had been doing this complicated work completely without her permission or assistance for 9 weeks already. She could do this. She would do this. She had not come to Damien Moretti for rescue. She had come because she believed, against all the evidence of the man she had just encountered in that office, that he deserved to know. That there was a version of him, the man from the restaurant booth, the man who laughed like he'd forgotten how, who might want to know. She had been wrong about which man would be waiting for her up there. That was on her. She had made the mistake of loving someone more completely than she had allowed herself to see him. She would not make that mistake again. She hailed a cab. She gave her address. She sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the city slide by and started, with the particular methodical focus that had gotten her through every hard thing in her life, to build the plan. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that 20 minutes after she left his office, Damien Moretti was still standing at his window looking at the city. He had not moved to his desk. He had not called his lawyers. He had not done any of the things he told himself he was going to do. I was standing at the window and he was seeing, against the back of his eyes, the look on her face when he'd torn the photograph. Not the anger. Not the tears she'd refused to shed. The moment before all of that. The 2 seconds when she'd walked in and set the image in front of him and looked at him the way she'd looked at him that first afternoon in the restaurant. Like she still believed, against a fairly solid body of evidence, that there was something in him worth coming toward. He'd killed that look. He'd done it deliberately and completely, and with the full force of the self that had been built for exactly this kind of severance. It had been necessary. He was certain it had been necessary. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window and stared at the city 42 floors below. She. Emily had said she. He didn't know why that word was sitting in his chest like something sharp. Damien Moretti had been many things in his life, and most of them were not things you said in polite company. The public face was real enough in its way. The legitimate businesses, the charitable foundations, the quarterly earnings calls and ribbon cuttings, and carefully managed reputation. He had spent 20 years building that face with the same precision he applied to everything, because the face was necessary, because the thing underneath the face required protection. The Moretti organization was not a story he could tell in this office, in this building, in any room where phones might be recording. It was a thing that existed in the spaces between the legitimate world and the other one, the one that ran on fear and loyalty, and the understanding that certain problems were solved in ways the law didn't provide for. His father had built it. His father's father had built parts of it. Damien had inherited it at 32, when his father had a stroke that left him a man with a face, but nothing behind it, and he had run it since then with the same cold competence he applied to everything he touched. He did not love it. That was the thing people didn't understand about men in his position. You didn't have to love the machine to run it. You had to understand it, which he did. Every pressure point, every alliance, every threat from within and without. You had to be willing to do what it required, which he was, or had been. He had made decisions in this life that he carried the way most people carried old injuries. They didn't stop him from moving, but he felt them in certain kinds of weather. Emily had been something outside all of that. The only thing, in a long time, that had felt like a door opening into a room where the air was different. He had let himself go through that door further than was safe, and he had known better, and he had done it anyway, because he was human in ways he could never entirely train out of himself. And now she had stood in his office with a torn photograph in her hands and said, "I loved you," in a voice that held no demand and no manipulation and nothing except the plain weight of a true thing, and he had let her walk out. He turned from the window. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon he didn't want and stood at the bar cart and thought about the cancer. The diagnosis at 28, the treatment, the specialists who had looked at him with the careful sympathy of people delivering permanent verdicts. He had never particularly mourned it. Children had not been part of the life he was building. The infertility had seemed like just another cost, filed and accepted and moved past. He was not infertile. No, he was. He was certain of that. He drank the bourbon. He set down the glass. Somewhere in this city, Emily Brooks was in a cab with a torn photograph and a baby that she said was his, and he had called her a liar with a face of stone and told her her employment was finished. He was certain the child wasn't his. The medicine was clear. The specialists had been clear. He was certain. He picked up his phone and stood there for a moment, not calling anyone, just holding it. Then he set it back down and returned to his desk and opened his laptop and pulled up the quarterly figures for the real estate division and stared at numbers that told him nothing about why a single word, she, kept rising to the surface of his mind like something that refused to sink. Emily spent the following week with her head down and her heart locked. She told Cassie, had to, because Cassie showed up at her apartment on Saturday with a bottle of wine and the particular radar of a lifelong best friend. And Emily was bad at lying to people she loved. Cassie, who was loud and practical and allergic to pretending things were fine when they weren't, sat across from her at the kitchen table and listened to the whole story without interrupting, which was unusual enough that Emily knew she was more worried than she was showing. When it was over, Cassie said, "He tore the ultrasound." "Yes." "In front of you?" "Yes." "Okay." Cassie looked at the table for a moment. "I'm going to need you to talk me down from some impulses I'm currently having. Please don't do anything." "I'm not going to do anything." She looked up. "Are you okay?" Emily thought about that carefully, because she had enough self-knowledge to know that her default answer to that question was reflexive and often inaccurate. "I think I'm going to be okay," she said. "I'm not okay right now, but I will be." Cassie reached across the table and took her hand and held it without saying anything, which was the right thing to do and which Emily had always valued about her. "What's the plan?" Cassie asked after a while. "Transfer departments? I put in the request yesterday. There's an opening in the research division on the 22nd floor, different building entrance, different elevator bank. I won't see him." "You're going to stay at the company?" "I need the health insurance. I need the salary. I can't afford to quit, Cassie." She said it plainly, without self-pity, because it was just the math. "Once I'm on medical leave, the benefits carry me through the delivery. After that, I have 3 months. I'll figure out the rest when I get there." Cassie nodded slowly. "And if he comes after you legally?" "He said he had lawyers, but he also thinks the baby isn't his. If he genuinely believes that, there's no legal angle for him to come at me from. He can't claim paternity, he denies." She paused. "When Sophia's born, I'll do the test. At that point, whatever he wants to do with that information is his choice." Cassie went still. Sophia. Emily realized what she'd said. She hadn't meant to say it. The name had surfaced on its own, as names did sometimes when you'd been thinking them quietly for days without acknowledging you were thinking them. "Sophia Grace," Emily said. "I think." Cassie looked at her for a long moment, then squeezed her hand hard. "Sophia Grace Brooks," she said. "That's a hell of a name." Emily smiled for the first time in a week. It was small and slightly broken at the edges, but it was real. "Yeah," she said. "I think so too." The transfer came through 10 days later. Emily moved her desk on a Tuesday when the office was quiet, carried her own boxes because she didn't want to explain anything to anyone, and settled into her new workspace on the 22nd floor with the efficient purposefulness of a woman building a perimeter. She did not see Damien. She did not expect to. What she did not know, and would not know for months, was that he was asking about her. Not directly. Damien Moretti never did anything directly that he could do through layers. But his assistant had quietly confirmed her transfer. Her personnel file had been accessed from the executive level within 48 hours of her visit. And somewhere in the 42nd floor office overlooking the Chicago skyline, a man who had told himself with iron certainty that the matter was closed was finding that certainty harder to maintain at 3 in the morning than it was in the daylight. He had not slept properly in 10 days. He told himself it was work. The Lakeview development had problems. There were pressures from the other side of his life that required attention, decisions being made in rooms that didn't appear on any official org chart. He was a busy man. Insomnia was a professional hazard. At 3:45 on a Thursday morning, he sat in his apartment with the lights off and the city spread out below him like a circuit board, and thought about a woman who had said, "I love you the way you said a true thing you weren't asking anyone to do anything about." He thought about the scar on his thigh, about what the doctors had told him at 28, and at 33, and again at 37. He thought about the word she. He thought, what if you're wrong? He sat with the thought for exactly as long as it took to become unbearable. Then he picked up his phone and started working, the way he always did when something got too close to the thing behind the armor. But the thought didn't go away. It sat in the back of everything, quiet and specific, like a sliver you couldn't quite reach. What if you're wrong? Mja said. Emily was 14 weeks along when she finally let herself cry about it. Really cry. Not the contained shaking on the sidewalk or the tight throat she'd been managing for weeks. But the full thing, ugly and exhausting, at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night with Cassie's voice on the phone and nothing to hold on to. It wasn't about Damien, exactly. Or it was, but it was bigger than him. It was about the version of the future she had been quietly constructing in the margins of the last 4 months, the thing she hadn't let herself articulate even internally, because articulating it would have made it too real and therefore too possible to lose. A version where someone who knew all her spreadsheets and her methodical anxiety and her uncomfortable habit of saying exactly what she meant looked at her and stayed anyway. A version where she didn't have to do the hardest thing alone. She cried until she was empty. Then she washed her face, drank a glass of water, and put the vision away in the same place she put everything she needed to survive without. She was going to be okay. She was going to be more than okay. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach, still almost imperceptibly rounded, the baby a secret she was carrying for both of them now, and made the same promise she had been making since the sidewalk outside Moretti Tower on that November afternoon. I've got you, she thought. Whatever it takes, wherever it goes, I've got you. Outside, Chicago kept moving, indifferent and constant, the way cities were. And on the 42nd floor of a building that bore his name, Damien Moretti sat behind his desk at 11 at night with a quarterly report open in front of him that he hadn't read in 20 minutes, staring at a city he controlled large parts of and unable to stop thinking about a woman he had thrown away and a word she had used, that continued to feel inexplicably and infuriatingly like the most important thing he had heard in years. December came in hard that year, the kind of cold that didn't negotiate. It just arrived and settled into the bones of the city like it owned the place, turning sidewalks to glass and stripping the last of the trees bare overnight. Emily noticed it the way she noticed most things lately, practically, as a problem to be managed. She bought a heavier coat 2 sizes up from her normal because her body was changing faster than she'd expected, and she stood in the department store fitting room looking at herself in the mirror, the unfamiliar curve of her stomach, the tiredness around her eyes, and thought, not for the first time, that she didn't entirely recognize the woman looking back. She was 16 weeks along. The nausea had finally started to ease. The fatigue hadn't. She took the 6:15 bus to work every morning now because the parking fees near the 22nd floor entrance were different from the executive lot she'd used before, and the bus was more practical. She sat in the back and ate crackers from a sleeve in her bag and read reports on her phone and did not think about Damien Moretti. She had gotten very good at that particular discipline, the way you got good at anything you practiced relentlessly. She gave the thought exactly no space. When it surfaced anyway, as it did at random and inconvenient moments, she looked at it steadily for 1 second and then moved it out of the frame. She had a life to build. There was no room in it for that. The research division was quieter than Hargrove Analytics had been, more insular, and people left her alone in the way that people in large offices left the new transfer alone, a kind of neutral indifference that suited her perfectly. Her new supervisor was a methodical man named Garrett, who cared about deadlines and accuracy and nothing else, which meant their working relationship was uncomplicated. She ate lunch at her desk. She left at 5. She came home and cooked something real because the pregnancy had given her an unexpected craving for actual meals. And she sat at her kitchen table and ate alone and thought about crib dimensions and healthcare costs and the particular logistics of maternity leave, and she was fine. She was absolutely fine. She called her mother twice. The first call was the one where she told her, and it went about as expected. Marion Brooks cycling through shock and worry and a kind of helpless love that expressed itself as a series of practical questions Emily couldn't yet answer. Who is the father? Is he involved? What are you going to do? Emily answered as much as she could, kept the version of Damien she offered vague and factual. Someone she had been seeing, it didn't work out, he isn't going to be part of this, and absorbed her mother's anxiety without adding to it, the way she had done since childhood. The second call was better. Her mother had metabolized it by then, and arrived at the place she always eventually arrived at, which was determination. Marion Brooks had raised Emily alone from the time Emily was 7, and she knew something about building a life from scratch. And when she said, "I'll come down whenever you need me," Emily believed her. She had people. She reminded herself of that. She had people. She had a plan. And she had a daughter growing steadily and defiantly inside her, regardless of whether anyone else in the world acknowledged her existence. That was enough. It had to be. What Emily could not see, because she had built her perimeter well and kept her eyes forward, was that 16 floors above her the situation was considerably less contained. Damien Moretti had not slept more than 4 hours in a row since the day she'd walked out of his office. He would not have admitted this to anyone, and no one would have asked, because the people in his immediate orbit had learned over many years that certain things about him were not available for comment. He looked the same from the outside. The controlled posture, the deliberate voice, the face that processed everything without visibly reacting to any of it. He functioned. He made decisions. He attended the meetings and took the calls and managed the machine with the competence of a man who had never permitted himself the luxury of falling apart. Inside the machine was a different matter. It was a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of December when Nora Moretti showed up at his office without an appointment, which she alone was permitted to do because she was his younger sister and the only person alive who didn't require managing. Nora was 37, a year younger than Damien looked, and where he was armored, she was direct in a way that occasionally felt like a blunt instrument. She worked in the legitimate side of the family interests, the charitable foundation their mother had established before she died. And she navigated the gap between that world and the other one with the pragmatic compartmentalization of someone who had grown up understanding exactly what the family was. She walked in without knocking, dropped into the chair across from his desk, and looked at him. "You look terrible," she said. "Good morning, Nora." "I'm serious. When did you last sleep?" "I sleep." "You look like a man who lies down and stares at the ceiling for 6 hours and calls it sleeping." She crossed her legs, settled back, studied him. "What's going on with you?" "I'm busy. Quarter close." "It's always quarter close with you." She watched him the way she'd always watched him. The particular scrutiny of someone who had known him before the armor went on and could still sometimes see the shape of what was underneath. "Marco said you canceled the Carlisle meeting yesterday." "It got rescheduled." "You don't reschedule Carlisle. You've been doing business with that family for 8 years. "Nora, what happened?" Damien put down the pen he was holding. He looked at his sister across the desk and measured, the way he measured everything, what it would cost to say nothing versus what it would cost to say the truth. Nora was not someone you could successfully lie to by omission. She found the gaps and she pushed on them. "There's a situation," he said. "A situation. A woman I was involved with came to me 6 weeks ago. She claims she's pregnant." Nora's expression didn't change immediately. Then it shifted by degrees, first to something careful, then to something sharper. "Claims. I told her it wasn't possible. You know why." "I know what the doctors told you 15 years ago." Nora's voice had gone quiet in the way that meant she was paying very close attention. "What did she say?" "She said the child was mine. I told her she was lying. I had her transferred out of her department and I told her we were done." He said it cleanly, factually, the way he reported anything unpleasant, as information, not confession. Nora looked at him for a long time. "How long were you with her?" 4 months. "And you think she was lying?" "The medicine is clear, Nora. 2 specialists. I'm infertile." "We're infertile," she said. "Damien, that was more than a decade ago. That diagnosis was from when you were 28. Bodies change." The follow-up at 33 showed reduced fertility, not 0. "I remember that conversation." She leaned forward. "Did she know about the cancer?" He was quiet. "Did she?" Nora pressed. "Not the full details. I told her it was surgery." "So she came to you with a pregnancy she had no reason to fabricate, knowing nothing about a medical history that could contradict her. She could have done research. She works here, worked here. Access to... Listen to yourself." Nora's voice was not angry, which was worse. It was the voice she used when she was trying to reach him through the part of him that was still reasonable. "You accused a woman of lying to you without giving her any basis to understand why you were accusing her. You threw her out. I protected... You panicked." She said it with a kind of plain sorrow that landed harder than accusation would have. "You got scared and you put the armor on and you did the thing you always do, which is you burned it before it could burn you first. The room was very quiet. You don't know her, Damien said. No, but I know you. Nora stood up. She was not done. He could see it in the set of her jaw. She moved to the window, arms crossed, looking out at the December sky. Have you thought about what happens if you're wrong? I'm not. Have you thought about it? Not a question, a demand. He didn't answer. Because if you're wrong, Nora said, still looking at the window, you accused a woman who was telling you the truth of betrayal. You took away the one thing she came to you with, proof of the child, and you destroyed it in front of her. And then you fired her. She turned to face him. That's not a mistake you fix with a phone call, Damien. The doctors were clear. The doctors were working with 15-year-old data. She walked to his desk. She put both hands flat on the surface and looked directly at him, and when she spoke, her voice was very low. Get tested again. He met her eyes. Get tested again, she repeated. Whatever it costs you, whatever it means, do it. Because if there is any chance at all, that woman is out there carrying your child and believing you think she's a liar, you need to know that. She straightened up, picked up her bag from the chair, and walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. She has a name, by the way. Emily Brooks. I looked her up. She paused. She seems like someone worth being wrong about. Then she was gone. Achem. Damien sat at his desk for a very long time after the door closed. He did not pick up his phone. He did not open his laptop. He sat with his hands flat on the desk and his eyes on the window, and he thought about the things Nora had said the way you thought about a wound you'd been ignoring, with the particular dread of someone who suspected the examination was going to confirm what you'd been working hard not to know. Bodies change. I was 41 years old. He had been carrying the infertility as a settled fact for 13 years, a door that was closed, a thing that had been filed and accepted and moved past. He had never questioned it because questioning it would have required wanting something behind that door, and wanting things he couldn't control was not a luxury he had ever permitted himself. He picked up his phone. He called a number that didn't appear in his contacts under any identifiable name. A private physician who handled the medical needs of him and several people in his organization with complete discretion. A man who asked no questions and kept no records that could be subpoenaed. I need to see you, Damien said when the call connected. This week. I have Thursday at 7, before clinic hours. Thursday's fine. He hung up. He sat in the silence of his office and breathed in and breathed out and tried to locate the feeling in his chest under the usual armor and found something he hadn't felt in a long time. It felt like fear. Emily found the note on her desk on a Wednesday afternoon. It wasn't from Damien. It was from his assistant, a woman named Claire who had always been professionally cordial and gave nothing away. And it was brief and formal. Mr. Moretti requests a brief meeting at your earliest convenience, no further details. A number to call to schedule. Emily read it 3 times. She turned it face down on her desk. She sat for a moment, her hand resting on her stomach without thinking about it. The gesture she'd been making more and more lately, automatic, grounding, the instinct of someone keeping something safe. Then she turned the note face up again and read it one more time. She picked up her phone. She called Cassie. He wants a meeting, she said when Cassie answered. Silence on the other end. Then, okay. His assistant left me a note. What does it say? Exactly nothing, just that he wants to meet. Ignore it, Cassie said immediately. I'm thinking about it. Emily, I know. She pressed her fingers against her forehead. I know. But what if it's about the position? What if he's using HR as a... He tore up your ultrasound picture. I know what he did. I need you to sit with that for a second before you go anywhere near him. Emily sat with it. She sat with it thoroughly, which meant she sat with the fullness of it, the look on his face when he picked up the photograph, the flatness in his voice when he said that's not possible, the horrible precision with which he had torn it, not crumpled, not thrown, but torn with the deliberate economy of a man eliminating a problem. I'm not going, she said. Good. I'm going to respond through HR and tell him any communications need to go through the formal channels. Even better. A beat. How are you feeling? Tired. She leaned back in her chair. Across the office, her coworkers moved through their afternoon routines. Oblivious. Ordinary. The baby's moving. Cassie's voice softened. Yeah? Yeah? Started 2 days ago. It's not much yet, just a flutter. But it's there. That's real, Em. Yeah. Emily stared at the ceiling for a moment. That's very real. She sent the HR response through official channels that evening. She did not receive a reply. Damien sat across from his physician on Thursday morning at 7:15 in an office that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, and he answered questions he had answered before and underwent an examination he had undergone before and waited. The preliminary results came back within the hour. He sat in the chair beside the physician's desk, while the man across from him spoke in the measured, careful language of someone who understood that the words he was arranging would have consequences he couldn't fully predict. The 2010 assessment found near total azoospermia, the physician said. Very low sperm count, severely impaired motility. At the time, conception would have been functionally impossible. He paused. These results are different. Damien heard his own heartbeat. The treatment you received in 2009 caused significant damage, but in a small percentage of cases, around 5 to 10%, the body partially compensates over time. Spermatogenesis can recover partially in the years following treatment. Not fully, but partially. Another pause. Your count is still well below normal range. Motility is impaired, but conception, under the right circumstances, would not be impossible. The word impossible sat in the air between them. How long? Damien said. His voice was completely flat. How long could this have been the case? Based on what I'm seeing, the recovery likely began somewhere in the mid-2010s. Possibly earlier. The physician met his eyes. You may have been capable of conception for as long as 5 to 7 years without knowing it. The room did not move. Damien was aware of his hands on the arms of the chair, the pressure of his grip, the cold of the leather. He was aware of the antiseptic smell and the early morning gray of the light through the window and the sound of traffic beginning to build outside. I was aware of a manila envelope being placed on a desk, an image in black and white, hands, steady, careful, deliberate hands, tearing it in half. Is there anything else you need from me? The physician asked. Damien stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He stood there for a moment with nothing on his face that gave anything away, which was the only way he knew how to stand. No, he said. Thank you. He walked out into the December morning. The cold hit him like a wall, and he stood on the sidewalk outside the medical building and breathed. In, out, slow, deliberate, and looked at the street in front of him without seeing it. He had been capable of conception for 5 to 7 years. Emily Brooks was 20 weeks pregnant with a child she said was his. And he had stood in his office and looked at the evidence of that child's existence and torn it in half and told her she was lying and taken away her job and told her the only thing she was to him was a woman he had spent some time with. He stood on the sidewalk. The cold was significant and he barely felt it. There was a thing happening inside his chest that he did not have adequate language for because he had spent 20 years building a self that did not require language for feelings. A self that processed and assessed and acted without the messy interior noise of regret or shame. He had built that self on purpose, stone by stone, because the life he had lived required it. The stones were not working. He pulled out his phone. He stood on the sidewalk in December with his thumb over the screen and thought about calling her directly. He had her number still, had never deleted it. The particular cowardice of a man who couldn't bring himself to perform the last clean severance. And then he thought about what she would hear when the call connected, and he knew, with the cold clarity that was one of the few things he trusted about himself, that a phone call was not something she owed him and not something she should have to manage. He put the phone away. He needed to think. He needed, for possibly the first time in his adult life, to figure out how to do something that all his particular skills and competencies had not prepared him for at all. He needed to figure out how to face what he had done. The call came to Cassie's phone at 9:45 that night. Cassie was sitting with Emily on Emily's couch, both of them in their pajamas, watching something on television that neither of them was really watching, Emily with her feet up and her hands folded over the firm curve of her stomach. Cassie looked at her screen. It's a number I don't know. Don't answer it. Cassie answered it. Emily watched her face. The expression that moved across Cassie's face in the first 5 seconds of the call was complicated, surprise, then something harder, then the particular compression of someone deciding very carefully how to be. She doesn't want to speak to you, Cassie said into the phone. Her voice was flat. I'm going to say that clearly, so there's no confusion. A pause. No, I heard you. Another pause, longer. Whatever was coming through the phone was making Cassie's jaw tighten. That's not my call to make. And right now, tonight, the answer is still no. She hung up. Emily looked at her. That was him, Cassie said. Emily already knew. What did he say? Cassie turned to face her fully. Her expression was the expression of a woman trying to give accurate information while managing several strong feelings about that information. He says he had new testing done. He says he has results that he needs you to see. She paused. He says he thinks he made a mistake. The television played quietly in the background. Emily's hands were still on her stomach. The baby was still, not moving. She thought about a desk, a photograph, two clean halves. He thinks, Emily said. That's what he said. The room was quiet for a long time. Emily, Cassie started. Don't, Emily said. Her voice was not angry. It was something flatter than anger and more final. Don't tell me to think about it tonight. I know what you're going to say, and you're probably right, and I am not capable of this tonight. Cassie nodded. She didn't push. Emily sat on her couch in the apartment she was going to have to figure out how to afford alone, with her daughter moving quietly beneath her hands. And she stared at the television and thought about a man standing at a window 42 floors above the city. And she thought about the months she had spent learning the shape of someone she'd believed was real. And she thought, even if he's wrong, even if the medicine misled him, even if there is an explanation for every terrible thing, what does sorry look like from a man like that? What does it cost him? What does it cost me? She didn't have the answer, not yet. But the question was there now, and it wasn't going away, and she understood, with the methodical clarity that had gotten her through every hard thing, that sooner or later she was going to have to face it. Outside, Chicago was cold and indifferent and loud. Inside, Emily Brooks pressed her hands flat against her daughter's warmth and breathed. He didn't call again. That was the thing Emily hadn't expected. That after Cassie had hung up on him, after that night on the couch with the television running and the unanswered questions settling into the room, like weather, there would be silence. Not pressure, not lawyers, not the next maneuver from a man who ran his entire life through calculated leverage. Just silence. It lasted 4 days. She worked. She ate. She slept in the particular fractured way of the second trimester, deeply for a few hours, then awake at 3 in the morning with her mind running and her body restless, and the baby making small movements that she was still not entirely accustomed to. The flutter that had become something more deliberate, more insistent, as if Sophia Grace already understood that her mother needed reminding she was not alone in this. On the 5th day, a courier arrived at the research division front desk with a sealed envelope addressed to Emily Brooks, marked personal and confidential in handwriting she didn't recognize. Not Damien's. She knew his handwriting from months of notes left on hotel pillows and margins of printed reports he'd handed her across restaurant tables. This was someone else's. Formal, careful. She took the envelope to the bathroom and opened it, standing at the sink. Inside was a single document, a medical report, 8 pages, from a private physician whose name she didn't know. The date was 4 days ago. The subject was Damien Moretti, and the contents were exactly what Cassie had said they would be. A complete assessment, clean and technical and written in the unsentimental language of medicine, laying out in clear terms the history of his treatment, the 2010 diagnosis, and the current findings that contradicted it. Partial spermatogenesis recovery. Viable, if impaired, fertility. Possible for a period of 5 to 7 years. She read it twice standing at the sink. Then she folded it back into the envelope and looked at herself in the mirror. 22 weeks pregnant, dark circles under her eyes. A woman who had built a very disciplined life around not being surprised by the people she loved. And she breathed. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even communication, not really. It was evidence, delivered through a courier, the way a man who dealt in information rather than feeling would choose to say, I may have been wrong, clean, documentable. Nothing that required him to be in the room. She put the envelope in her bag. She went back to her desk. She did not cry, and she did not call Cassie, and she did not do anything for the rest of the day except work with the focused, methodical concentration of someone who understood that the alternative was to sit with a feeling she wasn't ready to name. That evening, she called her mother. Not to talk about Damien, she wasn't there yet. She called because she needed to hear a voice that had known her before she knew how to be careful, and Marion Brooks answered on the second ring with the particular alertness of a woman who had learned to read her daughter's silences. "How are you?" her mother said. "I'm okay." "You don't sound okay." "I'm 22 weeks pregnant and it's December and I haven't slept a full night in 6 weeks. I probably just sound like that." A short silence. "Is it the baby's father?" Emily leaned her head back against the couch cushion. Her apartment was quiet. The envelope was on the kitchen counter where she'd set it when she came in, and she was aware of it the way you were aware of something with a low-grade radiation. Not dangerous enough to run from, too significant to ignore. "There's a complication," she said. "What kind?" "The kind that doesn't have a clear answer yet." She paused. "He thinks he made a mistake." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "Do you believe him?" Emily thought about a medical report laid out in 8 precise pages. She thought about the particular impersonality of that delivery. Not a letter, not a conversation, a document, and whether that said something about the man or something about the limits of what he knew how to do. "I believe he genuinely thought he was right," she said slowly. "Whether that matters, I don't know yet." "It matters," her mother said. "It doesn't fix everything, but it matters." Emily stared at the ceiling. "I know. You don't have to decide anything tonight. I know that too." She got off the phone and sat in the silence of her apartment and looked at the envelope on the counter and thought, this is the thing about evidence. It changes what you know. It doesn't change what happened. Both things were true and they didn't resolve each other. Damien's transformation, in those weeks, was not a clean thing. It happened the way structural changes happened, slowly, under pressure, invisible until it wasn't. He told himself he was being practical. He was correcting an error. He was doing what any rational man did when presented with new information that overturned a previous assumption. He revised. But it wasn't rational. He knew that. At 3 a.m, when he lay in the dark of his apartment and thought about a woman reading a medical report in a bathroom somewhere, he knew that what was happening inside him was not the cool recalibration of a decision-maker managing new data. It was something older and less manageable, the particular agony of understanding precisely what you had thrown away and having no certainty you would ever get it back. He had spent 20 years building a life in which he could not afford to feel that. You ran an organization like his by being the man who made the hard call and moved on, who did not look back because looking back was operationally useless and personally catastrophic. Regret was a luxury he had denied himself so consistently that he had convinced himself he'd lost the capacity for it. He hadn't. It had just been waiting. He called a therapist. This required more from him than the medical testing had, because the medical testing was just a question of information, and this was a question of something he had no framework for. The therapist was a man named Dr. Okafor, who worked with high-stress professionals and asked blunt questions without apparent judgment, and in their first session, Damien sat in the chair across from him and answered questions in the same measured, controlled way. He answered everything until Okafor asked him, with the mild directness of someone who had heard a great many versions of this. "When you tore the photograph, what were you feeling?" Damien opened his mouth, closed it. "Not what you were thinking," Okafor said. "What were you feeling?" The room was quiet for a long time. "Afraid," Damien said finally. It came out rougher than he intended, like the word had edges. "I was afraid." "Of what?" He looked at the window. "Of wanting something I couldn't verify. Of being—" He stopped. "Of being made a fool of. Of hoping for something that had no business being possible." Okafor wrote something. "So you destroyed the evidence of the hope." The accuracy of it was brutal. Damien sat with it. "Yes," he said. He kept the appointments. That was the first change. Not dramatic, not visible from outside, but it cost him more than he could easily account for, the act of sitting in a room once a week and being asked to locate things inside himself that he had spent decades paving over. He also began, quietly and carefully, to alter certain aspects of the organization, not wholesale. He was not naive about what restructuring the operation of a criminal enterprise looked like in practice. It was not a thing you did overnight, and doing it carelessly got people killed, including yourself. But there were operations he had tolerated because they were profitable, and not because they aligned with anything he could defend, and he began extracting himself from them. Slowly, methodically. The way you dismantled anything load-bearing, with attention to what collapsed if you pulled the wrong piece too fast. He set up a trust fund in Sophia's name. He had the paperwork drawn through the same attorney who handled all his most discreet business, and he made no announcement of it, and he did not tell Emily, because telling Emily would have required contact she hadn't given him permission to make, and because he understood, with the newness of someone learning a thing he should have known much earlier, that doing something good for someone and telling them about it were not the same action and did not deserve the same credit. I did it because it was right. He left it alone. He also assigned 2 members of his security detail, discreet, experienced, people he trusted as much as he trusted anyone, to watch Emily's building. Not to surveil her, not to report her movements to him, simply to be there, at a distance she would never know about, because he was a man who understood better than most what the world contained, and she was a woman alone with his daughter, and the thought of anything reaching her through the spaces he couldn't control was the one thing that cut through the armor faster than anything else. He did not tell her this either. It was not something she would have welcomed. It was something he could not stop himself from doing. January arrived, and with it the 24th week, and the anatomy scan that Emily attended alone with a folder of questions she'd prepared, and the steady, practical courage that had characterized her approach to this entire experience. The scan was long and thorough, and the technician moved the wand with professional calm, and Emily lay on the table and watched the screen and saw her daughter in extraordinary detail, the chambers of her heart, the arc of her spine, the small fist she held briefly near her face before moving it away as if in afterthought. Everything was healthy. Everything was exactly as it should be. Emily sat in the car outside the clinic afterward for a few minutes before starting the engine, not thinking about anything in particular, just breathing. The images were in her hands, printed, slightly glossy, unmistakable. A small face in profile. Evidence, this time, that she would not be letting anyone near. She thought briefly and without permission about a man who had never seen anything like this. She started the car. It was Cassie who broke the silence, not intentionally. She ran into Nora Moretti at an event in mid-January, a fundraiser for a local literacy nonprofit that both of them had apparently supported for years without ever meeting. Cassie didn't know who Nora was immediately. She found out when Nora introduced herself, and the name landed, and Cassie went very still in the way of someone recalibrating quickly. Nora knew who Cassie was. She had done her research. "I'm not here to ask you for anything," Nora said. They were standing near a window with glasses of sparkling water, the party moving around them, and Nora's voice was direct and her eyes were straightforward. "I just want you to know that I know what my brother did, and I know it was wrong, and I'm not going to insult you or your friend by pretending otherwise." Cassie looked at her for a moment. "Okay. He's trying to fix it. I don't know if that matters to her." "I don't know either." "It should matter a little," Nora said. "Not because he deserves it, but because whatever happens between them, that baby deserves a father who's actually trying to be worth something. And right now, for whatever it's worth, he is trying." She paused. "He's a hard man to know. He was made hard by things that happened before he was old enough to choose anything different. That doesn't excuse the specific thing he did, but it's context." Cassie was quiet for a moment. "She's 24 weeks pregnant, and she's doing it completely alone." "I know. She doesn't need his context. She needs—" Cassie stopped, reconsidered. "I don't know what she needs. That's her business." "Yes," Nora said. "It is." They stood in silence for a beat. "He set up a trust fund," Nora said, "for the baby. He didn't tell Emily. He's not going to tell her." She looked down at her glass. "I thought you should know. Not to change anything, just to know." Cassie told Emily the next morning. Emily was standing in her kitchen making coffee when her phone rang, and she listened to Cassie's account of the encounter and stood very still with the coffee scoop in her hand. And when Cassie finished, Emily didn't say anything for a long moment. "A trust fund," she said, "apparently. That he set up without telling me." "Yes." Emily set down the scoop. She looked out the kitchen window at the January gray of Chicago morning, at the bare branches and the colorless sky, and the street below where her life was moving without drama, in the particular unglamorous way that lives actually moved. "That doesn't fix anything," she said. "No. It doesn't undo the photograph." "I know." A long pause. "But it's—" Emily stopped. She tried again. "It's real. It's a thing he did that nobody told him to do and that he didn't tell anyone about." She pressed her fingers against her forehead. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it right now." "I know." Her voice was tight in the way it got when she was holding something carefully. I know. She got off the phone. She stood in her kitchen and thought about a man who had torn a photograph in half and was now, in the wordless and imperfect and deeply insufficient way available to him, trying to account for it. She thought, this is not resolution. This is not forgiveness. This is not anywhere near either of those things. But she also thought, he didn't have to do that. The distinction was small and important, and she wasn't ready to know yet what it meant. The twist came on a Thursday. Not from Damien. Not from anything she could have anticipated or planned around, because the particular cruelty of real complications was that they arrived through angles you weren't watching. It came from HR. Emily was called into a meeting at 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday in the third week of January by a senior HR director named Patricia Voss, who had the pleasant, careful demeanor of a person whose job required delivering difficult things in neutral tones. The meeting was in a small conference room on the 22nd floor, and when Emily arrived, Patricia was already there with a folder and a glass of water and the particular stillness of someone who had prepared. "Thank you for coming in, Emily. Please sit down." Emily sat. She was 30 weeks now, her body unmistakably pregnant, the fact of it no longer something she could keep quiet or contained, and she felt it in rooms like this the way you felt any vulnerability, as something that couldn't be covered. "I want to be straightforward with you," Patricia said. "We've received a formal complaint through our legal division regarding your transfer to research. The complaint raises concerns about a potential conflict of interest, given your prior personal relationship with a member of executive leadership." Emily went very still. "The complaint," Patricia continued, "comes from an outside legal firm, not from anyone within the company directly." She paused. "However, given the circumstances, and given the nature of the concerns raised, we are required to conduct a review." "Who filed it?" Emily said. Her voice was calm. She was not calm. "I'm not at liberty to—" "It wasn't Damien Moretti," Emily said. Not a question. Because she knew it wasn't, not because she trusted him, not yet, but because the thing she'd read in the medical report and the thing Cassie had told her about the trust fund did not belong to the same person who would file a legal complaint through an outside firm to pressure her out of a job she needed for her health insurance. Someone else had done this. Patricia's silence confirmed it more than any answer would have. "There are people close to Mr. Moretti," Emily said carefully, watching Patricia's face, "who would prefer this situation to disappear quietly." "Emily, I can't comment on—" "I'm not asking you to confirm anything." She pressed her hands flat on the table. 25 weeks pregnant, sitting in a conference room, being handed the information that someone in Damien Moretti's orbit had decided she was a liability worth removing. "I'm asking you to tell me what the review involves and how long it takes," Patricia told her. 2 weeks. Standard process. During which time Emily would be placed on paid administrative leave. Emily listened to all of it. She asked the procedural questions she needed to ask. She thanked Patricia for her directness. She stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out of the conference room. In the elevator, alone, going down, she let herself understand the full shape of what had just happened. It wasn't Damien. She believed that. But Damien existed inside a world that had its own logic and its own threat assessments. And she, a pregnant woman carrying the air of the man who ran that world, was a variable that someone in that world had decided needed to be managed. She had been so focused on Damien himself, on the personal wreckage of what he had done and whether it could be repaired, that she had not fully looked at the structure he existed inside, the structure that she and her daughter also now existed inside, whether she had chosen it or not. The elevator doors opened. She walked through the lobby and out into the January cold and stood on the sidewalk and felt the wind come off the lake with its particular brutality and thought, this is not just about what he did in that office. This is about what his life is. And she was in it now. Her daughter was in it. The photograph had been torn in half and taped back together. And the trust fund existed in a lawyer's file somewhere, and it didn't matter, and none of the small private gestures mattered. If the world that man inhabited could reach into her workplace and threaten her livelihood with a phone call to an outside legal firm. She pulled out her phone. She stood on the sidewalk. She called Damien's number. It rang twice. He picked up on the third ring and said her name, Emily. With a quality in his voice she had not heard from him before, something stripped, something without the usual careful architecture. And she said, before he could say anything else, someone in your organization just had me put on administrative leave. Silence. I need you to understand something, she said. Her voice was very even. I am not going to fight you. I am not going to fight your lawyers or whoever made that call. But I need you to know that whatever you are, whatever your life is, I am not going to let it reach my daughter. Do you understand me? Damien's voice, when it came, was quiet. Who filed it? I don't know. Your HR department received it from an outside law firm. A pause that she could feel the texture of, not empty, not stalling, but the particular silence of a man identifying something and deciding what to do about it. I didn't authorize that, he said. I know. How do you know? She hesitated for only a second. Because it doesn't match the other things you've done. The silence between them was different now, loaded in a new way. Give me 24 hours, he said. That's not... Emily, his voice dropped. Give me 24 hours, please. She had never heard him use that word before. Not to her, not to anyone she could recall. It sat in the air between them on the phone line, exposed and undefended, and she understood that it cost him something real. 24 hours, she said, and then I'm calling my own lawyer. She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk outside Moretti Tower with her hand on her stomach and the cold coming off the lake and the full weight of the situation arranged around her. And she understood with the clarity that arrived sometimes at the bottom of things that there was no version of this that was simple anymore. Whatever Damien was becoming, whatever partial, insufficient, costly transformation he was attempting in the privacy of his own life, the machine he ran had a momentum of its own. It had people in it who made their own calculations, and one of those people had just looked at Emily Brooks and decided she was a problem, which meant that Damien's change of heart, real or not, was not going to be enough. The question was whether he understood that yet, and whether he was willing to do what understanding it actually required. The 24 hours Damien asked for took him 6. Emily found out later, from Cassie, who found out from Nora, who had been in the building when it happened, that Damien had walked back into Moretti Tower at 4 in the afternoon on that Thursday, gone directly to the 42nd floor, and called a meeting that nobody in the executive circle had been given time to prepare for. No agenda, no advance notice, just the summons, and the particular quality of silence that moved through the building ahead of him when he was in a certain kind of mood. The man responsible for the legal complaint was named Gerald Fitch. He was 63 years old, had been with the organization for 19 years, and occupied a position in the legal division that was technically legitimate and actually something more complicated. He had handled sensitive matters for the Moretti operation for nearly 2 decades, the kind of sensitive matters that required a man who understood that loyalty to the organization sometimes meant acting before being asked. He had looked at Emily Brooks and made a calculation. Pregnant woman, personal connection to leadership, potential liability, no protection from above, since Damien had apparently severed the relationship himself. He had made the call to the outside firm as a preemptive measure, clean, deniable, efficient, the kind of thing he had done before and been quietly thanked for. He had not accounted for the fact that the calculation had changed. Emily didn't witness what happened in that conference room. She had only the outline of it secondhand, raised voices, a conversation that lasted 40 minutes, a resignation that was offered and accepted with a finality that left no ambiguity. Gerald Fitch left the building that Thursday evening with a box of his personal items and an understanding of certain consequences that didn't need to be spelled out, because men in his position had always understood them without spelling. The administrative leave review was withdrawn by Friday morning. Emily received the formal notification at 9:15. She read it standing in her kitchen in her pajamas with her coffee going cold on the counter and her phone in both hands, and she sat down at the kitchen table and stayed there for a while. He had done it in 6 hours. She called Cassie. Cassie already knew. How do you feel? Cassie asked. Emily thought about it. Like, I don't know what to do with any of this. That tracks. It doesn't fix, I know. It's just one thing. It's not nothing. She sat with that. Wasn't nothing. A man had moved against her, and Damien had removed him with the same decisive force he applied to everything. And he had not told her he was going to do it. And he had not told her after. And she had found out through the secondary channel of 2 women comparing notes at arm's length, which meant he was still not pushing, still not demanding she acknowledge anything, still operating at the edges of her perimeter rather than against it. That was not the behavior of a man running a play. That was the behavior of a man who understood he had no right to expect anything and was doing what he could within that constraint. She set her phone on the table. She pressed both palms flat against the surface and breathed. Outside the window, January Chicago was white and cold and indifferent, and inside Emily Brooks was a woman at 31 weeks pregnant, trying to figure out how to hold two true things at the same time. That what Damien had done to her in that office was real and unforgivable, and had cost her in ways she was still calculating, and that the man who had done it was not entirely the same man who was operating now. Both things were true. She didn't know yet what they added up to. February came. 32 weeks, 33. The baby growing fast now, the weight of it redistributing Emily's entire center of gravity so that she moved differently, thought differently, slept on her side with a pillow between her knees, and woke at 4 in the morning to the sensation of Sophia shifting position with the slow deliberateness of someone rearranging herself in a space that was getting crowded. Emily worked. She came back from leave and settled back into research and did her job with the same focused competence she brought to everything. Her supervisor Garrett noticed nothing, asked nothing, which was exactly what she needed from him. She took the bus. She ate lunch at her desk. She left at 5. She did not contact Damien. He did not contact her. But there was a shift in the silence, subtle as a change in barometric pressure, the kind you felt in your joints before the weather turned. She felt it sometimes in the elevator, in the lobby, in the moments between things when her mind had room to move. He was there, not in presence but in weight. The way significant unresolved things were there. The medical report she'd refolded so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. The trust fund she'd confirmed through her own lawyer, quietly, without Damien knowing she'd confirmed it, that existed in his daughter's name with a number in it that had taken her breath briefly away. She was building toward something. She didn't know its shape yet. The confrontation, when it finally came, did not announce itself. It was a Tuesday evening in the second week of February, 34 weeks, and Emily was leaving the building at 5:15 when the town car pulled up to the curb. She recognized it. The same model, the same plates as the one she'd ridden in with Damien 4 months ago, to a dinner on the north side that had lasted until 11 and ended with them standing on a dark sidewalk in the October cold, not wanting to be the one to say goodnight first. The window came down. Damien was in the back seat. He looked at her without saying anything for a moment, and she stood on the sidewalk and looked back at him, and neither of them spoke, and the city moved around them completely indifferent to whatever this was. He looked different, not dramatically. He was not a man whose surfaces showed things easily, but there was something around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of wearing that was different from exhaustion, like a wall that was still standing but had taken weather. "I'm not going to ask you to get in," he said. He stopped. Something crossed his face. "I need to say something to you. You can walk away after. That's your right." Emily stood on the sidewalk. "Say it," she said. He held her eyes. "I was wrong about all of it. Not just the medicine, the way I said it, the things I called you, the photograph." His voice was completely stripped of the architecture she had spent 4 months learning to read beneath. "I have thought about your face when I tore that photograph every day since December, and I don't have a language for what that cost me to understand about myself." A beat. "I'm not telling you this because I expect anything from you. I know I don't have the right to expect anything." Emily's hands were at her sides. Her heart was doing something complicated. "What do you want, Damien?" "I want to know my daughter." He said it quietly. "I want the chance to be someone worth knowing her. I understand if you decide that's not possible." He looked at her, directly, without the deflection she remembered from earlier in their history, without the managed distance. "I just needed you to hear me say it directly. Not through lawyers, not through couriers. Me, to you." The wind came off the lake. Emily felt it in her hair and against her face, and she stood in it and thought about a man in an office with a photograph in his hands. She thought about 6 hours and a resignation that didn't need to be explained. She thought about a trust fund and a medical report and a word, "please," that had cost something real to say. She thought about Sophia Grace, who was going to come into the world in 6 weeks, and who deserved every fighting chance at a complete life. "You'll need to keep working with the therapist," she said. Something moved through his face. "Already am," he said. "And the organization? I'm restructuring. It takes time. I won't lie to you about how long." He looked at her steadily. "But I'm done with the parts I don't need to be in, permanently." She studied him. The man she had fallen in love with in restaurant booths and hotel rooms, and the margins of business hours. She could see him still, underneath everything, changed, worn, carrying new weight. But there. I'm not ready, she said. I know. I'm not telling you no. I'm telling you I'm not ready. He nodded. That's enough. She turned and walked to the bus stop without looking back. And she did not know if he watched her go, and she did not allow herself to turn around to find out, because she was still building the thing she needed to be, and some doors you opened slowly or not at all. The call came at 2:47 in the morning on the 14th of March, 38 weeks. Emily had been awake already. She had been awake most of the night, the discomfort too layered to sleep through, the baby heavy and low and pressing on things that made rest theoretical. She was sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark when the first contraction arrived, and it was different from the Braxton Hicks she'd been having for weeks. Different in quality, in authority, in the unmistakable message that this was no longer practice. She sat with it, breathed through it, timed the next one. 8 minutes. She called Cassie first. Cassie answered on the second ring, already sounding awake, as if she'd been waiting. Is it time? I think so. I'm in the car in 10 minutes. Don't you dare try to drive yourself. I wasn't going to. You absolutely were going to. Emily almost laughed. The next contraction hit at 6 minutes, and she gripped the edge of the mattress and breathed through it with her eyes closed and her jaw set, riding the wave of it the way she rode everything. Not by fighting, but by locating the still point in the center and holding on to it until it passed. She got dressed. She packed the bag she'd had ready for 3 weeks. She moved through her apartment in the dark, methodical and calm on the surface, and something else entirely underneath, because this was happening now, and all the planning in the world became abstract when the actual thing arrived in its full physical reality. She was going to meet her daughter. The thought hit her in the kitchen doorway, and she stopped and stood there and let it land completely. Not a concept, not a future. Tonight, in hours. The contractions were 5 minutes apart when Cassie arrived. The hospital was quiet at 3 in the morning. The way hospitals were quiet. Not empty, but operating in a different register. The busy, purposeful movement of a place that ran on necessity rather than schedule. Emily was checked in and assessed and moved to a room and attended to by a nurse named Diane, who had seen everything and radiated the particular competence of someone who made the hard thing feel manageable. The labor was not fast. It was not the kind of labor Emily had prepared for intellectually, which was efficient and structured and within her capacity to manage through focused breathing. It was the kind that stripped everything down to the fundamental, just the body and the pain and the long, slow hours between where you had to locate resources you weren't sure you had. By 8 in the morning, she was 7 centimeters dilated and exhausted in a way that went past anything she could name, gripping Cassie's hand through the contractions while Cassie talked. Just talked, steadily, about nothing and everything, keeping her anchor to the surface of the world. At 8:45, Cassie's phone buzzed. Emily saw her look at it, saw the complicated thing happen in Cassie's face. Who? Emily said between contractions. Cassie hesitated. Cassie. Nora. She says he's in the building. Cassie looked at her directly. She called him. When you went into labor, I asked her to. Last month I told her to call him if it happened. She paused. I'm sorry if that was wrong. I thought, he's here? In the lobby. He's not going to come up unless you say yes. Nora made that clear to him. The next contraction came hard, and Emily closed her eyes and wrote it, and while she was inside it, she thought, in the brief unguarded place that hard pain sometimes opened, about standing on a sidewalk and saying I'm not ready, and having him say that's enough. The contraction passed. She opened her eyes. She looked at Cassie. Tell him to come up, she said. Cassie stared at her. Tell him to come up, Cassie. Not because it's fixed. Not because anything is decided. Her voice was wrecked from hours of labor, but it was steady in the way it always was when she was sure of something. Because she deserves to have him in the room. Cassie sent the text. He came through the door at 9:03, and Emily did not look at him immediately because another contraction arrived with the timing of a universe, with a cruel sense of drama, and she was not available for the next 90 seconds. When it released, she looked up and he was standing just inside the door, still in the coat he'd arrived in, like he hadn't wanted to assume the right to take it off. He looked like a man who had driven here in the middle of the night with his heart in his throat, and had not slept, and was holding himself with enormous care, the way you held yourself when you were terrified of taking up too much space. He looked at her. You came, she said. Stupid thing to say. He was here. Cassie called Nora. His voice was rough. I would have come, if I'd known. A pause. I would have been here from the start. I know. She met his eyes. I believe you. He came to the chair on the other side of the bed from Cassie. He sat down. He looked at her with everything stripped away. The armor, the architecture, the controlled surface that had protected him for 20 years. And she could see in his face the plain terror of a man who understood that something was about to happen that he did not know how to survive failing at. I need to tell you something, he said. Now? I should have said it in November. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped. I knew you weren't lying, not rationally. Rationally, I was sure of the medicine, but underneath that, he pressed his hands together hard. I knew you, and I chose the excuse the medicine gave me because the alternative was wanting something I thought I couldn't have. His jaw was tight. That's not your mistake. That's mine. And I am sorry, Emily. Not through lawyers, not through couriers. I'm sorry. The monitor beside the bed tracked Sophia's heartbeat, steady, fast, insistent, the sound of someone in a hurry to arrive. Emily looked at him across the wreckage of 7 months and the ruins of one photograph and the slow, painful architecture of everything that had been built and torn down and partially reconstructed since. She opened her mouth. The contraction hit like a wall. Everything that came next happened in the urgent, compressed reality of transition. The contractions arriving one on top of another now, the room filling with additional people, Diane's voice calm and directing, Cassie's hand in hers so tight the bones ached, and on the other side of the bed a man in a coat. He still hadn't taken off, who had no right to be here and was here anyway, who had broken the most important thing and was trying with everything he had to learn how to put it back together. Push, Diane said. Emily pushed. The world narrowed to the dimensions of the next 30 seconds. And in the room, holding onto the bed rail with both hands and his face completely undone, Damian Moretti waited for the thing he had almost destroyed to arrive. Sophia Grace Brooks was born at 9:41 in the morning on the 14th of March, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and her father's jaw and her mother's eyes. And she arrived into the world with the furious, indignant cry of someone who had opinions about the transition. The sound hit the room like a current. Emily heard it and felt something inside her chest unlock. A thing she hadn't known was braced until it released. Some deep structural tension that had been holding for 38 weeks finally allowed to let go. She was shaking. She couldn't stop shaking, and she didn't try, because the shaking was the body processing the fact that it had done the impossible thing it had been doing for 9 months, and the impossible thing was here now, outside, breathing, loud. Diane placed her on Emily's chest. Sophia was red-faced and furious and perfect in the absolute unreasonable way that newborns were perfect. Not despite the rawness of them, but because of it, the shocking reality of a new person who had not yet learned to be anything other than entirely themselves. She stopped crying the moment she felt Emily's skin, as if she recognized it, as if the specific warmth of her mother was a language she already spoke. Emily held her and shook and did not speak for a long time. Cassie was crying openly, not trying to hide it, making no apology for it. She had one hand pressed over her mouth and the other gripping the bed rail, and she was watching Sophia with the expression of someone witnessing something that reset their understanding of what mattered. On the other side of the bed, Damian had not moved. I was still in the chair, still in his coat, still leaning forward with his hands clasped, and he was looking at Sophia with an expression Emily had never seen on his face. It was not the controlled neutrality, and it was not the careful managed distance, and it was not the thing he wore when he was deciding how to handle something. It was nothing she had a name for, something prior to all of those things, something that belonged to a version of him that had existed before 20 years of building the man he'd decided to be. He looked like he had been destroyed, not by grief, by love. By the sudden arrival of a love he had not known was possible, and for which he had no armor prepared, because you could not prepare armor for a thing you had convinced yourself you would never encounter. He looked at his daughter for the first time in his life, and the feared mafia boss who controlled 17 legitimate businesses, and an organization that operated in the spaces between the law simply ceased to be the relevant fact about him. Emily watched his face. She said quietly, "Do you want to hold her?" He looked up. His eyes were wet, and he made no attempt to manage that, which was the most honest thing she had ever seen him do. "Yes," he said. The word came out broken at the edge. Diane showed him how to position his arms. He stood up from the chair, finally, and took off his coat and laid it over the chair back, and he took his daughter from Emily's arms with the extreme careful terror of someone handling the most important thing that had ever been handed to him. Sophia looked up at him. Newborns didn't focus. Not really. The world was still blur and light and sensation for them, everything too new to parse. But she looked in the direction of his face, and her small features were still and open, already trusting the warmth of the arms holding her, because warmth was warmth, and she was new enough to the world to accept it without qualification. Damien stood in the middle of the hospital room holding his daughter, and his face came apart completely, and he didn't fight it. For the first time in 20 years didn't fight a single thing he was feeling, and he held her against his chest and bent his head over her and wept with the full-body exhaustion of a man who had been holding himself together under impossible tension for a very long time and had finally, in the most unexpected of places, found the one thing that made maintaining the tension impossible. Cassie looked at Emily. Emily looked back at her. Neither of them spoke. The first months were not easy. Let that be said plainly, because the story deserved plainness at the end. Healing was not a montage, not a clean arc, not a series of meaningful conversations that resolved things in the right order. It was slow and nonlinear and frequently uncomfortable and required from both of them things that did not come naturally. Emily went home 4 days after the birth with Sophia in a car seat and Cassie driving and enough practical anxiety about the next 24 hours to fill a notebook. Her apartment had been reorganized 3 times during the pregnancy. The second bedroom converted, the logistics assembled, the spreadsheets completed. She was prepared. She was also completely unprepared because preparation was not the same as experience, and experience with a newborn was its own category of education. Damien did not come to the apartment immediately. He understood, without being told, that the space after the hospital was hers to define. He sent things, practical things, not showy, a car service available whenever she needed it, a meal delivery for the first 2 weeks that arrived without note or signature, as if from no one in particular. Cassie figured it out within 4 days and told Emily, who sat with it for a while and then let it be. He called on the 5th day. Not to push toward anything. To ask, simply, if he could come to meet Sophia, properly, without the hospital circumstances and without the weight of everything else in the room. Emily said yes. He came on a Saturday morning with nothing in his hands, no gifts, no gestures, and he sat on her couch and held Sophia for an hour, while Emily watched from the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee she barely drank. He talked to the baby in a low voice that Emily could hear but not make out, and Sophia slept against his chest with the complete unconscious trust of someone who had not yet learned that trust needed to be earned, and Damien held her like a man who understood he was holding something he had almost forfeited through his own failure and was determined, at whatever cost, not to fail again. He stayed 2 hours. He left without asking for more. He came back the next Saturday, and the one after that. The conversation that needed to happen happened in April, when Sophia was 5 weeks old and Emily had reached the particular threshold of exhaustion where the defenses came down not by choice, but by attrition. Damien had come for his Saturday visit, and Sophia had been fed and was asleep in the bassinet, and Emily had sat down on the couch and looked at him across the coffee table and said, with the directness she'd had since the beginning, "We need to talk about what you are." He had expected it. She could see that. He set down his coffee and met her eyes and said, "Yes. Not what you're becoming, what you are right now, what your organization is. I know. Because my daughter exists in proximity to it now, whether either of us chooses that or not." She looked at him steadily. "Gerald Fitch made one phone call and threatened my livelihood. He was working alone. What happens when someone with more leverage decides she's useful?" Damien's jaw was tight. "That won't happen. You can't guarantee that. I can take steps that make it as close to a guarantee as anything in this life is." "What steps?" he told her. Not everything. She understood there were things he would never be able to tell her fully, and she accepted that as the cost of the reality she was living in. But he told her enough. The operations he had already exited, the restructuring of the organizational hierarchy that reduced the number of people who had direct knowledge of his personal life, the security measures that had been in place around her since December, and which he explained now without apology, but with complete transparency. He told her about the legitimate holdings that were generating enough revenue that the other side of the operation was becoming strategically unnecessary rather than just morally untenable. He told her the timeline was 3 years, realistically, to reach a position where the organization existed on paper only. 3 years, Emily said. Yes. And in 3 years, I can't promise you a clean exit from everything I've been, he said quietly. I can promise you I'm building toward one. And I can promise you that Sophia is never, under any circumstances, a variable in any calculation I make. Ever. Emily looked at him for a long time. I believe you mean that, she said. I do. Meaning it and being able to deliver it are different things. Yes. He held her gaze. I know the difference. I'm telling you both. I mean it, and I am going to deliver it. You can hold me to that. She sat with it. Outside, April was doing something almost hopeful with the light, the first real warmth of the year coming through the windows of her apartment. Somewhere in the other room, her daughter was sleeping with the profound commitment of someone who had no concerns about the future. I need you to understand something, Emily said. I spent 31 weeks building my life without you in it. I made my peace with that. I made a good life. It wasn't the one I'd imagined, but it was real, and it was mine. I know. I'm not waiting to be rescued. I was never waiting to be rescued. I know that too. His voice was low. I fell in love with you because you weren't waiting for anything from anyone. You walked into my office and told me my acquisitions team had modeled the ROI wrong before you knew anything about me except that I signed your paychecks. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. The memory of a person he'd been briefly before he'd frightened it away. You were the first person in years who talked to me like I was a man instead of a position. The room was quiet. What do you want? Emily asked. Not what you think you should want. What do you actually want? He looked at her with everything open, the way he'd looked at her holding Sophia in the hospital, without the armor, without the managed surface. I want to be her father, he said, completely and without condition, for the rest of my life. A pause. And I want to earn the right to be in your life again. Not on a schedule, not with a deadline. I want to earn it the way it should be earned, by showing you, over time, through what I do and not what I say, that I am someone worth trusting. Emily looked at him. She thought about a torn photograph, carefully reassembled. She thought about the medical report, its pages worn soft at the folds. She thought about the trust fund and the meal delivery and the 2 hours of silent proof, every Saturday, of a man doing the hard and unglamorous work of becoming. She thought about what her mother had said all those months ago. It matters. It doesn't fix everything, but it matters. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay, she said again. We start there. We start from what's true right now, and we build something real. Not fast, not clean. She met his eyes. And if you break my trust again, I know. I need you to say it. If I break your trust again, he said, with the weight of a man who understood exactly what he was agreeing to, I lose both of you, permanently, and I will have earned it. The words sat between them with the gravity of a true thing. Emily nodded once. They were not back to what they had been. They were both too honest to pretend that. They were at the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet, built on the rubble of the thing that had failed, and it was uncertain and complicated and required from both of them a courage that looked nothing like the dramatic kind but was harder. The daily, undramatic choice to stay open to someone who had hurt you, to keep building when building was slow and unglamorous, and required showing up even when nothing was resolved. That was the thing no one told you about forgiveness. It wasn't a moment. It was a practice. It was something you did in the ordinary Tuesday of it, again and again, until the ordinary Tuesday was finally larger than the wound. The year that followed was not a story. It was a life. Damien showed up every Saturday, and then more than Saturdays. He was there for the small things, the undramatic things, the 2 in the morning things that were the actual substance of parenthood. He learned the particular pitch of Sophia's different cries. He learned which position settled her and which songs made her stop fussing and which faces made her laugh. The sudden shocked laugh of a baby encountering delight for the first time, the sound of it restructuring whatever it touched. I was not a natural. He had no model for this. His own father had been a presence defined by power and distance, a man whose love was demonstrated through provision rather than presence. And Damien had internalized that template so completely he had assumed for years that it was the only one. He learned differently, slowly, in the particular classroom of a small person who had no interest in his competence and every interest in his attention. He kept his therapy appointments. He worked on the organizational restructuring with the methodical patience of a man who understood what was at stake if he moved carelessly. He stepped away from meetings that 3 years ago he would have considered non-negotiable because he was recalibrating what non-negotiable meant. And the recalibration took consistent effort and the occasional failure and the practice of getting back up after the failures without using them as evidence that he couldn't change. He didn't pressure Emily. He was there, he was consistent, he demonstrated rather than declared, and he gave her the time she needed to see him without the weight of expectation distorting the view. Emily, for her part, was watching. Not with suspicion, not forensically, but with the honest, open attention of someone who had decided to give a real chance to a real thing and was determined to see it clearly rather than through the filter of what she wanted it to be. What she saw was a man learning, at 41, things that most people learned much earlier, learning them clumsily and sometimes badly, and without the particular grace of someone for whom it came naturally, learning them anyway. The stubbornness of it moved her, the refusal to quit even when he got it wrong, the absence of self-pity, the commitment to the next attempt without requiring anyone to notice the effort. One evening in October, Sophia 8 months old and asleep in her crib and the apartment quiet in the particular warm way of autumn evenings, Emily and Damien were sitting at her kitchen table with the remains of a dinner neither of them had cooked. She had, actually, and he had done the dishes without being asked, which she had noted without mentioning. They were talking about something ordinary. She couldn't remember afterward exactly what it was. Something about Sophia's development, or about a book Emily was reading, or about nothing in particular. And she realized in the middle of a sentence that she was not performing ease. She was not managing her comfort level, or monitoring her own reactions, or conducting the quiet, ongoing risk assessment that had characterized every interaction with him for the better part of a year. She was just sitting at her kitchen table having a conversation with a man she loved. The realization was not dramatic. It arrived quietly, the way the most important things did, not with fanfare, but with the simple insistence of a true thing asserting itself. She loved him still. She had not stopped, not entirely, even through all of it, the photograph, the accusations, the long months of building a life without him in it. She had packed it away and built on top of it and told herself the building was the important thing, which it was. But underneath the building, the foundation had been there the whole time, stubborn and inconvenient and absolutely hers. She didn't say it that night. She wasn't ready to say it that night, and she had learned enough about the difference between feeling a thing and speaking it aloud to respect the gap. But she looked at him across the kitchen table and she let herself feel it without immediately managing it, and that was its own kind of beginning. They were married the following March, 11 days after Sophia's first birthday, in a ceremony that was small and private and attended only by the people who had been present for the actual story. Cassie, who cried again, openly and without apology. Nora, who had been the one to name the truth back in December, and who stood through the ceremony with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had advocated for the right outcome. Marion Brooks, who had driven down from Rockford and held her granddaughter for most of the evening, and a handful of others whose presence was about love rather than appearance. There were no grand speeches. Damien was not a man who had ever been comfortable with grand speeches, and Emily was not a woman who needed them. What they said to each other was simple and direct and between them, and the weight of it came not from the words themselves, but from everything the words had survived to reach. Sophia, in a white dress her grandmother had bought, and her father had thought was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, was held through most of the ceremony by various adults who took turns because she was at an age that required significant engagement to remain cooperative. At one point she reached up and grabbed Damien's face with both hands in the imperious way she had developed, pulling his nose toward hers, and he laughed. The real laugh, short and surprised, the one that had always seemed to catch him off guard. And Emily saw it and thought, there it is. There's the man I found in a booth on a Tuesday afternoon. He made it through. They all made it through. There is a photograph on the wall of their home, in a simple black frame, hung in the hallway where you see it when you come through the front door. It is not a professional photograph. It is 2 pieces of paper taped together at the center with a thin white line running through the middle of the image. A grainy black and white ultrasound image, the small, comma-shaped figure of a child in the early weeks of existence, slightly blurred at the edges, the tape yellowed now with time. Visitors sometimes ask about it. It is an odd thing to hang, damaged, imperfect, clearly mended rather than replaced. Emily always answers the same way. She says, it's a reminder. If they ask what kind of reminder, she thinks about it for a moment, and then she says, the kind that tells you the cost of a mistake doesn't disappear when you fix the mistake. It lives in the repair. And you keep the repair visible, because forgetting the cost is how you repeat it. Damien, if he is in the room when she says it, says nothing. He doesn't need to. He has looked at that photograph more times than he could count, in more moods than he has language for, and it has become for him the one object in his life that he cannot look at without feeling the full weight of what he is. Not the man he was built to be by circumstance and violence, and the particular damages of his history, but the man he chose to become when choosing was the hardest available option. The photograph stays on the wall. The tape holds. The image is imperfect and whole. Sophia, at 3, likes to point at it when her father carries her past. She points and says, "That's me," with the confidence of someone who has always known exactly where she belongs. Damien holds her against his chest and looks at the image of her before she was Sophia, before she was a name or a face or a laugh, or the specific weight of her in his arms, and he says, "Yes, that's you." And then he says the other thing he always says, quietly, into her hair, "You almost didn't make it here." He doesn't mean her health. He means the cost of almost, the narrowness of the margin, the real and devastating possibility of the world in which he had been right about himself and wrong about her, and spent the rest of his life on the wrong side of a door he had locked with his own hands. She doesn't understand it yet. She is 3. She accepts it as she accepts everything her father tells her, as information from someone who loves her, which is the only context she has ever needed. But she will understand it someday. Emily will make sure of that, not to burden her, not to make her carry the weight of her parents' damage, but because Sophia Grace deserves the full story. Because the full story is the only honest gift either of them has to give her. The full story is this. 2 deeply imperfect people found each other in an elevator and in a restaurant booth and in the margins of ordinary hours, and one of them made a catastrophic mistake, and both of them paid for it. And out of the pain came a daughter and a marriage and a life built not on the fantasy of 2 people who never failed each other, but on the harder, more durable truth of 2 people who failed and came back and decided that the coming back was worth the cost. That is not a romantic story in the easy sense. It has too many sharp edges. Too many nights when the progress was invisible and the doubt was real, and the easier option, the one where you protected yourself by walking away from the complicated thing, was right there, available, waiting. They did not take the easier option. That is the whole of it, when you strip away everything else. They did not take the easier option, again and again, in the small and unglamorous repetition of ordinary days, until the ordinary days were something they had built together and could not imagine having built any other way. Outside, the world continued to be exactly what it was, complicated and indifferent, and full of people doing the best they could with what they had been given and the damage they had survived. Inside, a little girl pointed at a torn photograph and said, "That's me," with the absolute confidence of someone who has never had cause to doubt she was wanted. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.